Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Ferguson Library. We continue to celebrate Toni Morrison's Beloved with our third program in the speaker series. Tonight our speaker is Greg Pierrot, who is the Associate Professor of English at UConn and Stanford. He's the author of Decolonized Hipsters, The Black Avenger in Atlantic Culture, and the co-editor of a forthcoming anthology titled Anthology of Haitian Revolutionary Fictions. He has appeared in Africa as a Country, LA Review of Books, and other scholarly journals, such as the African American Review. Next week, please join us for Gothic Elements in Toni Morrison's Beloved with Professor Blessing Diallo Agamba on Wednesday, October 27th at 6:30. She will be coming to us via Zoom. And lastly, our finale presentation with Farah Jasmine Griffin, who is the author of Read Until You Understand, The Profound Wisdom of Black Life and Literature. The Big Read programs comes to us with the NEA Big Read grant. We have flyers. Please check out our website and our calendar for upcoming events. Thank you and welcome.
Good evening. Thank you for having me this evening. Thanks to Elizabeth and to the Ferguson Library. So I've been asked to speak of the works and world of Toni Morrison. This title is arguably misleading because anyone who's read Toni Morrison will likely agree that her novels are both of this world and of many others. The multifaceted world of African-American experience illustrated by the many inner worlds of individual characters that she created. I want to refer here to a talk by Toni Morrison entitled The Site of Memory, in which she discussed the African-American literary tradition and its roots in autobiography and memoir and in the genre of the slave narrative. Evoking the writings of such pioneers as Olaudah Equiano, Henry Box Brown, or Lydia Maria Child, she mentions how they had to shape their writing to match the conventions and expectations of their time and of white readership. So they might denounce the horrors of slavery, yes, but within reason. And some horrors were not to make it into print. I quote here, over and over, the writers pull up the narrative short with a phrase such as, but let us drop a veil over these proceedings too terrible to relate. Most importantly, at least for me, there was no mention of their interior life. So she's referring to, stylistic element that's typical of those narratives, this sort of modesty about the most awful things the authors had to face. But it covers a different kind of modesty that to her is related. The fact that very often these narratives tend to eschew mentions of their authors and other African-American people's interior life. And so she goes on to explain how her own craft as a fiction writer differs from those of her forebears. And I quote again, "My job becomes how to rip that veil. And that job," she continues, "requires certain things. I must trust my own recollections. I must also depend on the recollections of others. These memories are the subsoil of my work, but only the act of imagination can help me." There's much to unpack in this program. Morrison places her work at the confluence of history, memory, and fiction, sharing a sense of mission inherited from the earliest days of the African-American writing tradition, claiming also a boldness and freedom only possible thanks to the political struggles leading to the mid-20th century when she began writing. And as she recognized herself also, I believe, setting a path for the discussions of our own time. Excuse me. And so today I'll speak about where Toni Morrison came from, what she wrote, and how her world, how the world she created mirrored and sometimes jarred with the world in which she lived and died, focusing more specifically on Beloved. So I expect you've probably heard a lot of this by now, but I'm going to go over it anyway, and that is Toni Morrison's life. I will begin at the end, though. When she died on August 5th, 2019, Toni Morrison was 88 years old, the recipient of a National Book Critics Circle Award for Song of Solomon in 1987, of an American Book Award and a Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for Beloved in 1987, Commander of the Arts and Officer of the Legion of Honor in France, holder of a National Humanities Medal and Presidential Medal of Freedom, of honorary degrees from UPenn, Yale, Oxford, Princeton, to name but a few, and of course, holder of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993. And this is a really short list. The full list of awards goes much longer than this. Between 1970 and 2019, she authored 11 novels, 7 nonfiction books, 6 children's books, 2 plays, and a libretto. This year's Big Read focuses on what is arguably a best-known novel, Beloved. It owes its iconic status to many things beyond Morrison's talent. The novel's harrowing and provocative subject matter has been a source of debate and heated arguments since its first publication 34 years ago. Today, I'll speak generally of Morrison's life up to the publication of this novel and discuss also the general cultural and political context in which it was produced and published. I have a few photos. I think you've probably seen some of these, but some of these were new to me, including this one that I'll mention in just a minute. Toni Morrison was born Chloe Anthony Wofford in Lauren, Ohio on February 18, 1931, the second of 4 children born to George Wofford and Rama Willis Wofford. Her father was from Georgia and moved up north in his teens to escape the racist violence common in his state. Her mother's family was originally from Alabama. Her parents moved up north in the early 1900s when the threat of racist violence also became too intense for them. Her youth was not easy. During the Great Depression, work was scarce, especially for African Americans. Her father worked many different construction and factory jobs, but he was often unemployed. Her mother worked at home and sang in church. They lived in an integrated working class neighborhood, yet if segregation in the North was not as brutal or drastic as in the South, it still existed. Pools, lakes, other public venues were either barred African Americans or kept them apart from white people very often. Morrison has told an anecdote that says much about the poverty and hostility they faced even up north. As her family could not pay rent one month, their landlord demanded that they leave the house, to which her father refused. And when they refused, the landlord tried to set the house on fire with the family inside of it. Morrison, when she mentions this story, which she didn't remember herself, but this having happened when she was very young, but this obviously was part of the family law, said that it taught her about the necessity of humor to help live through this kind of violence. Just, for mention, it's indicated here, but this is the house in which she grew up in Ohio. And this on the side is a photo from her high school yearbook, around 1945, probably. Her parents were fighters. They stayed in the house. Her mother would perform acts of resistance and defiance, such as sitting in segregated areas in movie theaters or writing President Roosevelt when the flour they received as part of government subsidies during the Depression came infested with bugs. Chloe had to experience a share of racism from white children and other people in the area, including the people she worked for as a teenager. She worked in cleaning people's houses for quite a while. But her mother was an example of resistance and reliance. There was much music in the house. Her mother, Rama, sang in church, as I mentioned. Her father had been Rama's father, who lived with them, had been a professional violin player for a time. Living with her maternal grandparents made the connection to elders a very concrete and important part of her life. And this is also something that she would often talk about, and obviously that we see echoed in our writings as well. Chloe had to care for them when they got older and sick, and in the process, she heard their stories. And much space was given to storytelling in the house as well, notably ghost stories, which I'm sure you see is relevant for Beloved, certainly, but also her family members, including her grandparents, routinely spoke of their dreams. They read avidly. Her grandmother had a book to interpret dreams, which she used on a regular basis, including to analyze Chloe's dreams. And her grandfather, though he was never formally educated, read all the time. Her mother, Rama, was part of a book club And Morrison could read before she entered the first grade. And she's mentioned this also in interviews, the book club. Of course, they didn't have very much money, so this was a treat of some sort, but also obviously illustrates just how important reading was for the family. She was widely read early on, notably as a student at Lorraine High School, where she was inducted in the National Honor Society. She graduated in 1949, going on to study at the HBCU, Howard University in DC, so historically Black college and university, Howard being one of the most prestigious ones. She was the first woman in her family to go to college. This is one of my favorite photos that I found preparing this. This is a photo of Chloe Warford at Toni Morrison graduation along with her mother. As she started being called in college, majored in English, which is word to the wise. At that time, even HBCUs almost exclusively taught white authors, and she studied the American canon, notably Melville, Hawthorne, and Faulkner. Social life was very class-focused, and Toni was not part of the wealthy crowd, so she focused instead on the theater club, joining the Howard University Players, with whom she toured the South in the summers, which was her first experience going in the southern states. She graduated in 1953 and went on to study to grad school at Cornell University, where she graduated with an MA in English in 1955, writing her dissertation on death in the writings of Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner. While she was there, the Supreme Court handed in its decision, in Brown v. Board of Education, which ruled segregation in public schools unconstitutional. The year she graduated, the implementation decree was released, ushering in the desegregation of schools around the country. At that time, Morrison herself was a professor teaching between 1957 at Texas, starting in 1957, at Texas Southern University in Houston, one of the largest HBCU in the country, before she returned to Howard, where she would teach for 7 years between 1957 and 1964. So it's a short timeline here that will also illustrate what I was talking about. So she's mentioned also, she's talked about this in several interviews when the topic was brought up of Brown v. Board of Education and desegregation. Much like Zora Neale Hurston, another phenomenal writer from a different generation, Morrison did not support integration when the ruling came down. She thought that instead funding would be better used if given to existing Black schools, and this way it would be more profitable to students. One thing she thought then was that integration was bound to be a problem for Black students. This was not an uncommon position in the African-American community at the time, as many had long defended the necessity of autonomy for the Black community in all departments of society. Morrison was always a political thinker, though she mostly stayed away from party and organized politics. She fearlessly expressed her politics in her writings throughout her life. As the civil rights movement was picking up pace, Morrison stayed away from direct involvement, in part because of this kind of disagreement, but also because she had gotten married to Jamaican architect Harold Morrison in 1959. They had their first son in 1961. So this is not a complete timeline, obviously. More events could and probably should have been included here, but this was just, to sort of give a sense of where she was, what she was doing in the early years of the civil rights movement. She didn't participate as other people might have at that time. She was not in sit-ins. Howard itself was also a fairly conservative institution at the time. Those students themselves obviously would make things a bit different. What she was interested in, as you might come to know, was literature, but maybe not the way one might expect. In an interview, when asked, "Did you know as a child that you wanted to be a writer?" Morrison answered, "No, I wanted to be a reader." And that's the reason why she joined a writers group at Howard in 1962, because she wanted to read other people's writing. where we all get lucky is the rule in that group was that if you joined, you actually had to write something. Now, Morrison had been part of her high school journal. She'd been writing for a long time. And so originally when she joined the group, she just used pieces of writing she still had from high school until the moment when she ran out and she actually had to write a new story. And she decided to write the story of a young woman who would like to have blue eyes. That may sound familiar to some of you. If not, I'll make that clear later. That short story would become the basis of her first novel, as we'll see. In 1964, pregnant with her second son, she resigned from her position at Howard and went on a European trip with her husband. Their relationship had long been strained, and their temperament and ideas about relations were incompatible. This is about as much as Toni Morrison ever said about this. They separated on the trip and got divorced on their return. Harold returned to Jamaica and left Toni with a young son and another on the way. She had her baby back in Ohio in her parents' family, in her family's house. But the same independent spirit that had befuddled her husband, decided Morrison to go look for a new job rather than stay at her parents'. She quickly found a job as a textbook editor in Syracuse, in New York State, at a place where she knew absolutely no one. So when she moved there with two sons, she started writing on what she describes as very lonely nights, notably picking up the short story that I just mentioned, which she turned into the first draft of a novel. And so, sorry. Yep. She was promoted in 1967 to a senior position in New York City. So she moved to the city at that point. She was put in charge of mass market books at Random House. So she moved from textbooks to actual novels. These were the early years of the Black Power era, with a new generation of radical activists and artists taking the African-American scene by storm. That's another date I could have mentioned on my earlier timeline. In 1966, a young student activist and member of SNCC, Stokely Carmichael, made a very famous speech about Black Power that sort of, changed the tide, not just in U.S. and African American politics, but also in the art scene. Arguably, it had started earlier with the Black arts movement in around 1964, but this was the state of very politicized or increasingly radical discourse, both in the arts and in politics at that point. So Toni Morrison was working at Random House. I'll get back to that in a minute. The violence characteristic of those years, racist violence in the streets, assassinations across the country, and violence abroad, of course, with the invasion of the Dominican Republic in '65, the war in Vietnam, among other things, was all over the pages as well. An important question for Black artists was whether and how to include politics in their art. That year, 1967, as it happens, was also the year when Southern white author William Styron published The Confessions of Nat Turner. I'm pointing it out as I believe that the debates surrounding this novel are actually relevant to contextualize Morrison's own views on the place of history in fiction and vice versa. Styron, as you may know, arguably tried to do something akin to Morrison's notion of returning interior life to text and to history that lacked it. At least that's what he claimed he was doing, by imagining the thoughts of famous slave revolt leader Nat Turner. So again, to contextualize, I don't know, you may or may not be familiar with this. In 1831, in the state of Virginia, was the most deadly slave revolt that ever happened on US soil. Was led by Nat Turner, local African-American preacher, who was then captured and tried and executed. The white journalist at the time published a text known as The Confessions of Nat Turner. Thanks to the internet nowadays, you can find this very easily on Google if you're interested. And that consisted mostly in the testimony that he obtained from Nat Turner in jail. This is one of a few documents that remained about Nat Turner, but once again, fairly little is known about the person himself beyond his acts. And so William Styron in his novel, uses this historical event, but sort of fills in the blank, right? And he creates a persona that turned out to become rather a real political problem at that time. The result, in which he imagined Nat Turner as a white woman-crazed rapist, did not go down well with African-American writers and thinkers of the time. Although such luminaries as James Baldwin or Ralph Ellison defended Styron, 10 authors, among whom John A. Williams, John Oliver Killens, and Charles V. Hamilton, wrote essays for a collection entitled William Styron's Nat Turner, 10 Black Writers Respond, published the following year. This was a book, but there were many articles published at the time also critiquing this novel. In fact, it went from a bestseller to within 6 months being a national, the object of a national debate. There once were plans to make a movie that never panned out because, within that time it had become a national issue. Among the many reproaches against the author, several of these 10 authors found fault in Styron's writing for failing to rein in creative writing as he meant to portray a historical figure, but also his failure to consider the place of Turner's family and community in his life. So, what many people resented was the fact that he entirely invented, it was based on no historical record, that Nat Turner was in love with a white woman. Much creative license there, let's say. I'm pointing here to a quote from another essay by Toni Morrison that I think is fairly, though she's not speaking about Styron in this moment, I think speaks to the way she might have reacted to this book. And I don't think she's on the record speaking about this specifically. This is from her book-long essay, Playing in the Dark, where she explores the literary representations of African Americans in American literature. And so she speaks, and she says because she grew up as a Black reader of white fiction, she would sort of be puzzled by the way African Americans were represented in those books often. And she said originally, as a reader, she always assumed that because they knew little about the Black experience, they would just sort of tiptoe around it. But what she says is that as a writer, she came to consider this from a very different angle. And she realized what she says here. I came to realize the obvious, that the subject of the dream is the dreamer. The fabrication of what you call an Africanist persona is reflexive, an extraordinary meditation on the self, a powerful exploration of the fears and desires that reside in the writerly conscious. And so, what she's saying here, and the way she tends to often speaks of the flaws of white representations of Black characters, is that she says what is revealed in the process is really much more about the white authors themselves than about the people they claim to represent. And so I think this says, again, something she might have said about Styron himself, but tellingly it also, I think, directs us towards what she would eventually consider to be part of her mission as an author and a Black author. It is nevertheless worth noting, so that book I mentioned earlier, the 10 authors responding to Styron, were all men, at a time when Black women were at the forefront of the struggle, both in the streets and in the publishing industry as well. And in this, Toni Morrison was very much a pioneer. So, as the editor and soon a senior editor at Random House, she was the first Black woman editor in the company. But in this position, she worked on and acquired such books as Angela Davis's and Muhammad Ali's autobiographies, writing by Black Panther Party leader Huey Newton and also George Jackson, poetry and fiction by June Jordan, Henry Dumas, Toni K. Bambara, or Gail Jones, who she introduced her. She was the first to publish her, and for introducing voices of the women's movement as well. So there's been several articles about her contribution as an editor, which is obviously not what we tend to think of her for. And she really left her mark on the industry, and not just at Random House, but she allowed for many of her peers of the time, or people that would become her peers because she wouldn't publish until 1970, to actually get published. In parallel to this work, she sent her own manuscript for the first novel, The Bluest Eye, which was published in 1970. She tells a pretty funny story when people asked her why she might not have sent this to Random House she was working for. She said she didn't think they would be pleased by the fact that she was writing. So she actually sent it to one of their competitors. And in the process also forgot to tell them that her new name, or her recovered name. They knew her as Toni Morrison, even though she was back to being Toni Warford. And she says that she only realized that this was the name they put on the cover by the time the book was published. And so that's the reason why she kept that name as an author, even though legally that was no longer her name. The first novel did not sell particularly well, but it was well received, and it gave Morrison recognition in the American and African-American literary establishments. She was solicited for book reviews and articles in the press, in different literary magazines and newspapers. At that time, she also started teaching part-time at SUNY Purchase. In 1971, we're talking about the different things that she wrote. She wrote an article entitled "What the Black Woman Thinks About Women's Lib" for the New York Times Magazine. Morrison always refused to call herself a feminist, but in this position paper, she illustrates rather masterfully the unique stance which Black women then called more readily womanism, or would call readily womanism, and which heralded what is now generally called Black feminism. So these are only 3 excerpts. It's a fairly long article. That you can tell they don't really follow. They're just 3 different columns, but I think sort of show the kind of argument she was making, which sounds familiar even in our day in the 2020s. Part of her argument is that while she did understand the general precepts of the feminist movement, she also felt that it was not adapted to the specifics of the lives of Black women, right? And the experience of Black women, that there was much that the movement could have learned from Black women if it only bothered, taking their angle into account. That's the very end here. That 3rd column is the very end of the article, where she sort of points in that direction, right? Her reflection about the specificities of Black womanhood not only echoes the writings of more theory-minded contemporaries, such as Audre Lorde or Bell Hooks, it also resonates in the fiction she edited by authors like Toni Cade Bambara or Gail Jones, and also in her own fiction, notably her 2nd novel, Sula, the tale of 2 girls, Nell and Sula, friends since childhood, who grow up to be drastically different women and yet 2 halves of the same soul. While Nell becomes a housewife, Sula becomes a rebel. She never marries, she goes on a life of adventure, and when she comes back home, she puts her friendship to the test of betrayal. I don't want to say too much in case you haven't read it. You should read it. As in her first novel, Morrison wrote a book because it spoke of something she had not read anywhere: the complexity of friendship, loyalty, good and evil between 2 Black women. Once again, though the novel did not sell especially well, it was met with critical approval, though several complained already about the violence of her characters and stories. And this would be a complaint that would follow Morrison throughout her career. She kept teaching part-time and working as an editor. In 1977, she published her 3rd novel, Song of Solomon, a rollicking fantastical epic revisiting ancient Greek mythology in African-American surroundings through the quest of a rare male protagonist, Macon Milkman Dead. That's his name. At that time, Morrison decided to commit to writing full-time. And again, the story is pretty interesting the way she tells it. She made that commitment before she found out whether or not the book was going to be a success. She decided to take that leap. And she said, I don't like to do things halfway. So I just decided that I was going to be a writer from that time on. It did fairly well, though. So sure, I guess we'll get lucky again. From then on, she only edited books very on a punctual basis for Random House. And she finally entirely quit that job as an editor in 1983. She would keep teaching in universities throughout her career, though, notably at Princeton, Yale, among other places. Song of Solomon was a success, as was the next novel, Tar Baby, published in 1981, though it was met with more mixed reviews than the previous books. For Morrison, the fact that the novel featured white characters made its politics that much harder for critics to deal with. And that's another thing, again, she talked about. She said, people seemed to be a lot more comfortable with her in the first three novels because mostly Black characters were concerned. But Tar Baby, having as among the principal authors, white characters, she said she thought that was part of the reason it was received more harshly. As a professor at SUNY at Albany, she wrote her first play, a commission from the New York State Writers Institute. It was called Dreaming Emmett, about the murder of Emmett Till. It was performed in 1986 to mixed reviews. The text of the play was never put to print, and Morrison allegedly had all copies of the script and video recordings of the production destroyed. That's the official story. People assume that there might be copies out there, but she never allowed them to be seen by anyone, except the people that were directly involved. It took Morrison 3 more years to write Beloved, her first novel to approach the topic of slavery head-on. As I'm sure you've heard many times by now, it was inspired by a true story which Morrison had first read about as an editor when she was working on one of the most important books she edited from Random House, The Black Book, a scrapbook of sorts covering 300 years of African-American history through newspaper clippings, song lyrics, photographs, advertisements, recipes, and all sorts of other documents, which she meant to tell the history of African-Americans from the point of view of everyday people. So as, sorry. Okay, sorry. So this was one of the documents that she discovered and chose to be part of the Black Book. And she'd found an article from the American Baptist, which the beginning of which you can see on the left here, telling the story of Margaret Garner, an enslaved woman who had escaped to Ohio in 1856 with her husband and 4 children, only to be recaptured by U.S. Marshals under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, a federal law that fined all who helped or even failed to arrest escaped enslaved people, even in states where slavery was banned. As in the novel, Margaret Garner, the real person, killed her daughter and failed to kill her other children before she was arrested. The hearings that followed lasted weeks. And so, there are other, obviously, archival sources about this case. When she was arrested in Ohio, even though she had been enslaved in Kentucky. And so the question became where she would be tried and whether she would be tried for killing her child. This might seem, it is gruesome in many ways, but the question was really important because it also had to do with whether she could be tried as a person or as property, right? Or whether she could be tried at all. Trying her in Ohio would recognize her as a person, which would be a problem in the face of this, of the Fugitive Slave Act, and also a problem for, the enslaver from Kentucky. So for weeks, they had this conversation in Ohio. Story was very sensational and an opportunity for anti-slavery activists to attack the fugitive slave law and for defenders of slavery to support it. Again, that's not known to anyone, but Ohio at that point was very much at the forefront of the slavery and anti-slavery proto-war, I want to call it. It wasn't a war yet, but it was very much on the way to being a war, partly because Ohio was a common halfway station for people escaping to Canada. So there were many people involved in the Underground Railroad. There were also many slave catchers all over Ohio and Cincinnati in that area. And so, this sort of put it at the forefront even more. The Kentucky enslaver kept Garner away so she would not be taken back to Ohio and eventually eluded the authorities. The case inspired poets and artists, one of whom portrayed Margaret as the new Medea, and this is the engraving in question. I'm quoting here from the article written by a pastor for the American Baptist, a newspaper of the time. He'd gone to see Margaret Garner in jail and asked her, if she had not acted in a fit of insanity. And she responded, I was as cold as could be. I would much rather kill them at once and thus end their sufferings than have them taken back to slavery and be murdered piecemeal. As many journalists and thinkers at the time, and those would be abolitionists, this to them was a drastic application of the revolutionary motto, give me liberty or give me death. So, and I'm not going to say much more about the case right now, but at the time, it was yet another of those stories that entered the national debate over slavery and also gave fodder to one of the many arguments against slavery at the time, which was that, in support of slave revolt, whether tacitly or clearly, which was that the struggle of the enslaved was, of course, in the American grain, or could be taken as such, right? The arguments against slavery were very similar to arguments that fueled the American Revolution. And this was the clear political dimension of this terrible act. But to return to the passage I started with, this was also an approach that eschews interior life, right? To go back to that comment that Morrison made about early African-American literature. This is focusing on the event itself without thinking or considering, well, what can bring a mother to make that decision in all knowledge of its consequences. What Morrison does in her novel, of course, is explore this event as the human tragedy that it was. And by focusing on characters and their interior life, is like putting the authority back into the hands of slaves rather than the slave owner. And this is the way she talked about the novel itself. The tragedy of this human moment is perhaps best illustrated by Morrison herself, who in an interview said about Margaret Garner's act that it was the right thing to do, but she had no right to do it. And the novel goes on to explore just what that might even mean. All right. For contextualization that I think might be interesting here, and maybe more reading suggestions, because those are always good. Beloved places itself in a line of novels dedicated to just that goal, right? Exploring the interior life of the enslaved and African-American Black people in general. And it is paradoxically eminently political and historical, precisely in that it seeks to explore the intimate and the personal. While one may imagine this to be an essential element of fiction, what wasn't then was fiction about the time of slavery. So that might be surprising, but there really weren't that many novels focusing on that specific time up until the late 60s. Indeed, though slavery and its scars come up regularly in African-American fiction, the time of slavery itself rarely came up in novels until then. From then on, a spate of authors, many of them women, explored similar topics with a similar outlook. And thus, Beloved echoes the approach of Gail Jones's Corregidor, a brutal and honest story set in the 20th century, but which explores a woman's terrible family history and how the genealogical trauma impacts emotional and intimate life over generations. Once again, if I'm vague, it is on purpose. If you read the novel, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I am not going to ruin it for you, but I strongly recommend you check it out. You may remember from a few slides ago, I mentioned it. This novel was actually edited by Morrison herself. In fact, she mentioned in interviews something that's very relevant to that novel, that when she started researching the history of slavery for Beloved, she had a hard time finding adequate museums in the US. And she was saying at that moment in time, there were very few, if any, museums about slavery, and most of them were very, again, roundabout, not unlike the text she mentioned earlier. And so she had to go to Brazil to find museums that she thought were adequate for what she was looking for. Brazil, as it happens, is the country in which much of Corregidora's past is set. Morrison and Jones's approach to memory also have much in common, though their writing arguably could not be more different. And here again, I don't want to say too much about this, but yeah, she writes in a very, very different style, even though they obviously have many interests in common. You may also have heard, if you pay attention to those things, or if you like Gail Jones, that she just came out of 22 years of silence to put out a new novel that's called Palmares. Here we go. Just came out. The plan apparently is to put out 5 novels within the next 2 years. So I'm assuming they're already written. And so that's something to look forward to. I've not read it yet, in case you're wondering. So, but from the title and from reading about it, I can tell you that it is about the maroon compound by the same name that existed in the 17th century in Brazil and resisted attacks for decades. So, I find that really exciting. That's just an aside. Beloved also has much in common with Shirley Ann Williams's Deaths of Rose, a novel published a year before Beloved, which fictionalizes another true story concerning an enslaved woman who led a slave revolt in 1829 and whose execution was postponed until she gave birth. It has since been made into a popular musical that you may have heard of. I'm not going to speak of that plot either, as you should really find and read it, but I highly recommend it. What I'm more interested in here, and that may be, I think, relevant for our conversation tonight, is what the authors share in terms of approaches. Shirley Ann Williams described her goal in writing Deaths of Rose as wanting to reveal the beauty and pain, the ugliness and joy of 400 years of living in the New World, what this has done to Black people, and more importantly, what it can and does mean to them. Importantly, too, Williams originally wrote her novel as a rejoinder to William Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner, a callback to my previous point, and also a place to end in some ways. I mentioned earlier that many of the Black critics of William Styron took exception to the ways in which he let his imagination fly in the face of the historical record and how it threatened to reboot racist stereotypes and cliches under the cover of historical reenactment. Some critics of Morrison have had very similar things to say about Beloved, among others. Infamously, Stanley Crouch scoured the novel in a review where he lamented the influence of feminism on African-American writing. As it happens, Morrison had in many ways preempted his critique in the New York Times article about feminism some 16 years ago. So that article I was showing earlier. But more interestingly, in my mind, Crouch unwittingly pointed to something very important, which is that Black feminism's approach to memory was in fact changing the ways that we might think of the past by making readers consider the places of interiority, the many human tragedies at work in historical events, and notions often presented apart from the humans that they concern. I think it's not too much to say that the stakes Morrison saw in her fiction in general and in Beloved in particular, connected as they were to the developments of the time, have lit a path that now informs the way historians themselves look at Black history. Indeed, Morrison's efforts at recovering the interior life lost in historical documents informs the work of scholars such as Saidiya Hartman, whose publications count among the most innovative efforts in the past decades. So in her landmark 2008 essay, Venus in Two Acts, Hartman pondered about the impossibility and necessity to try and recover the lost lives of enslaved women in an archival record where they barely register. If you can see this very well. And I'm quoting here part of this passage. How does one recuperate lives entangled with and impossible to differentiate from the terrible utterances that condemn them to death? the account books that identified them as units of value, the invoices that claimed them as property, and the banal chronicles that stripped them of human features. And so this article, she goes over anecdotes that she'd written about in a previous history book concerning the murder of 2 enslaved women on a slave ship in the 1780s. And part of the issue that she faced is that all that we know of them are literally 2 lines in a ledger. And so, part of this triggers a reflection on what a historian can do with this little archival record. And she goes on to ask the following questions. If it is not possible to undo the violence that inaugurates the sparse record of a girl's life, or remedy her anonymity with a name, or translate the commodity speech, then to what end does one tell such stories? How and why does one write a history of violence? Why revisit the event or the non-event of a girl's death? And how does one tell impossible stories? Is it possible to exceed or negotiate the constitutive limits of the archives? Hartman proposes a technique that she calls critical fabulation, with requirements on narrative restraint, the refusal to fill in the gaps and provide closure, and the imperative to respect Black noise. And I would say those requirements, are both an echo to and the inverted mirror of Morrison's effort at filling the blanks with fiction. I'm still quoting Hartman here. By advancing a series of speculative arguments and exploiting the capacities of the subjunctive, a grammatical mood that expresses doubts, wishes, and possibilities, in fashioning a narrative which is based upon archival research, and by that I mean a critical reading of the archive that mimes the figurative dimensions of history, I intend both to tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its telling. So Hartman, describes a very peculiar effort at balance, respecting the archive or lack thereof, and still trying to imagine what that archive doesn't tell, right? I see this as an effort that mirrors the opposite effort that Morrison herself describes when she says, well, the archive avoided interior life, and this is where my fiction steps in. The historian's restraint exposed by Hartman never imposed upon Morrison, the fiction writer, but I believe the space Morrison created in her fiction made it possible for scholars like Hartman to develop the writing techniques for what she calls a history of the present. And I'm quoting again, a history that strives to illuminate the intimacy of our experience with the lives of the dead, to write our now as it is interrupted by this past, and to imagine a free state, not as the time before captivity or slavery, but rather as the anticipated future of this writing. Hartman describes the present as a place haunted by the dead. In this, she certainly echoes Beloved. Here's to hoping that Morrison can also inspire ways to lay the dead to peaceful rest. Thank you. I don't know if you have questions, but if you do, I'll be happy to try and answer them. That's a very good question. I believe, I think there's something about, that may be unpolitic to say this, but I think Stanley Crouch has a point. I don't think about her intent so much as the way why audiences might read her novels. And again, it's just the way it is, but he sees this as a flaw in her writing. I don't think that it is. I think, she often said she writes for Black people. but other people read her, obviously, and so I think that is part of what made her such an enormous figure. Also, just as pragmatically, potentially, much of her sales success came in relation to the Oprah Book Club. I mean, she was selling a decent amount of books before that, but when Oprah picked up her books, some of which had been out for years, it expand. I mean, the numbers are staggering. And I forget exactly how that went. I think she had a joke about it, but I think Oprah Winfrey said, "Well, you made this book club," and I think I'm paraphrasing here, but I think Morrison said, "Well, you made these books that had not necessarily sold very well the first time around." So I think this is a confluence of things. But I was just reading about this. You might think that the Nobel Prize would have helped sell books, and it certainly did, but it was really Oprah that made the big difference. So I think there's a confluence of things, but I think she her reputation goes beyond well, even beyond the US. Like, she really has a she's among the best known African American and American authors in France, for example, where I'm from. Where everybody loves her. So so I think it's maybe a confluence of things in this way.
My question is, who do you think of this generation can be comparable to Toni Morrison? Who can take on that mantle?
Tough one. Well, I mean, I think Edwige Danticat in many ways. I mean, their styles are fairly different, though they have also much in common. I would say, for similar generosity, and also, a place as a thinker beyond fiction. I mean, she's not the only one, I'm sure, but she's the first to come to my mind.
I was in Albany in 1986, and she was writer in residence along with William Kennedy, and I saw Dreaming Emmett, and it was probably one of the most impactful plays I've ever seen.
Wait, so what was the occasion? Was she reading, or? Oh, you did see it.
I saw the play. Yeah.
Oh, so,
yeah.
So what did you think? Because it's really funny to read. The everything that's mentioned about it is very. I mean, it's like a big mystery.
It was incredibly impactful, and in the second act, a woman came up out of the audience and said, "What about me? Where is the African American woman in this story?" Which was one of the things that really drove home the complexity of the whole story. But the other thing is, in the playbill, she dedicated the play to all of those African Americans who have been disappeared in New York City. And I guess at the time, there were many who had disappeared in the subways, which is, again, something I didn't know about.
Right. Thank you.
I like Alice's word, impactful. Many years ago, and I don't remember exactly when, New York Public Library was about to renovate the Rose Reading Room. And if you've ever been in it, it's magnificent. And they brought together a panel of people to talk about libraries and intellectual freedom. And I don't remember who any of the other people were on the panel, but I will never forget her and her words. She talked about public libraries as being, and the Rose Reading Room as the example, being the kind of place where you didn't need a ticket. Nobody would ask you why you were there. She referred to a young Black teenager sitting next to a captain of industry doing research. And as I say, I've forgotten everything else that happened that day, but I have never forgotten her. And then the American Library Association did a book on intellectual freedom, and I contributed a chapter using Toni's words because they just, that is what a public library is. It's open to everybody, and she understood that and understood what that meant to not just the Black people in New York City, but in general.
Mhm.
I think that was part in answer of why she was so important. I think part of it was all the teaching she did and the speaking she did and the comments that she made that really made a whole lot of sense. Anybody else?
I think it's always sort of difficult to, explain where, the popularity of a person or an author comes from. Right? I mean, is it in numbers? Is it in sales? How do we even measure it? I think, with Toni Morrison, that there is something about her as a person as well. That I think, sort of shines in all of our interventions in interviews on TV or, in different places. I was lucky enough to go to a seminar where she was speaking when I was a student at Penn State. And there really was something to her presence, right? I mean, it's sort of a cliche to say this, but it's very true. Someone who knew how to speak, which is not given to everyone, but she used that skill constantly. This, which was not the most momentous of occasions necessarily, but she was really. You could see, and of course, at that point, she was already very famous. So, I think her mere presence was probably enough to impress people. But there was more to it than that, and in no small part, I think the fact that she was so approachable in a moment when she didn't necessarily have to be. So.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. This was a really wonderful talk, and thank you for taking us into Toni's world. So again, join us for our next session next week on October 27th, when we hear about Gothic elements in Beloved. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.